I see the curation of artists from video as being something that sits within the history of cinema, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But my main kind of role in terms of programming is to program the gallery space, to program installation work by artists, as well as screenings that connect to it in the auditoria of artists from the video. So when I tell people that I'm a curator for the British Film Institute and that I curate screen-based works by artists, which is generally how I like to define it rather than saying artists, film, and video, there's two questions that I get, and they're neatly complementary, and they kind of say a lot about the people that ask them when I get them. One question is, how can film or video be art? And the other question is something like, how can any film or video not be art? And I'm going to answer both those questions, but there's no kind of complete answer to either of them. There are questions that exist as things which can be theorized about from a lot of different angles, but never really packed away. If you want to look at the kind of the first hater, the first guy that stood up and said, film and video can't be artworks, you'd have to go back to Walter Benjamin, who wasn't even necessarily writing about film and video work when he wrote the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And it's kind of a cliche to refer back to this text when you're talking about film and video work, but it has assumed such a great importance that I think we need to start there. Benjamin essentially said that when a work of art can be mechanically reproduced, whether it's a lithograph, a photograph, a film, or now through digital technologies, although when he was writing it was before the rise of digital technology, when a work of art can be reproduced by a machine, then it makes that work more accessible and thereby removes some of its aura. To Benjamin, a work of art was something that you could contemplate and that you could approach, but you could never really get close to, because its meaning or its essence always slipped away from you. That might be because there was such detail in it that you could never exactly sort of perceive it all, no matter how often you studied it. So his idea was that he defined aura as, he had this concept of aura which was basically defined as a function of distance. If you could get close to something, then it didn't have an aura. If something kept you away, then it had an aura. In the 60s, it was kind of a corollary to Benjamin's idea. And it was saying that despite the fact that an artwork can be reproduced using technology, every reproduction technology that mankind has invented introduces its own sort of grain or its own noise into the reproduction. It introduces a kind of artifact which is specific to its mechanical means and its time. So, a glass plate photograph from 1860 looks very different from the photograph that your mobile phone takes in 2006. And the artifact that gets introduced, whether it's incidental or purposeful, is something like the aura, because it is the thing that prevents us from getting close to the kind of perfection of reproduction and accessibility which Benjamin had kind of posited. So there's still a gap between the reproduction and not the original, but the idea of perfect reproducibility. And I want to show some images that I got from a book by John Maida. These are images of pixels which have been magnified many times. That's an image of a pixel from a cathode ray tube monitor from the early days, a vintage cathode ray tube monitor, let's say. And that's a closer-up version of the cathode ray tube. This is a close-up image of an LCD pixel, and that is a modern cathode ray tube monitor's pixel. And I think these are quite beautiful because they're sort of like, in this idea of like a perfect digital reproduction, we still have this failure of hardware to actually compute. So within that rainbow spectrum, maybe there is something which isn't exactly an aura, but it kind of approaches it, that prevents us from this total accessibility that Benjamin had feared.